Hello and welcome back to class. This is American Federal Government, and we have just concluded the 2024 election as of this showing. And Donald Trump will be the next president again. He will be the first president to have won, lost, and then won re-election since Grover Cleveland achieved that particular feat back in 1892 or 96. In any event, it's been a long time since we have had a president that has basically maintained control of one of our major political parties for 3 consecutive cycles. Obviously, since Franklin Delano Roosevelt, we haven't had a president just be able to maintain viability past 2 election cycles. And so it's a very interesting situation. We're still learning a lot about the election. One thing we can say is that this was a comprehensive Republican, victory. Republicans improved their performance with just about every demographic group, with the exception of one. White women over the age of 50, and women generally over the age of 50, generally rejected what Republicans were selling. But Donald Trump certainly improved his performance among young men, among Latinos generally. He won 47% as of this, this showing of Latino men. And I think, I think I made the point a couple of days ago that who's going to win this election is going to depend on what people are thinking about when they walk into the voting booth. And if more people walked into the voting booth caring about security, about immigration, about inflation, then Republicans were going to do well. And they did well because clearly a lot of people who came in were worried about immigration. And a lot of this has to do not so much with the idea of replacement theory, than with displacement. In a lot of urban areas, Republicans did better than they have done in the past, largely because those cities have had large influxes of undocumented immigrants who were making asylum claims and who had been shipped up to New York and Chicago and out to LA by Texas Governor Greg Abbott and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. And that stress that was put on those municipal systems affected people and how they perceived politics. I would also note, again, we don't know what the final vote tally will be. There's still a lot of votes that are out on the West Coast. California is notoriously slow about counting votes, and undoubtedly Kamala Harris's popular vote total will improve. But Donald Trump right now is sitting at 72 million votes. He got 77 million votes in 2020. And Kamala Harris is, I believe, at 67 million votes right now. Joe Biden got 82 million votes in 2020. So that tells you right there that the electorate shrank by at least a minimum of 16 million votes. And it's important to keep in mind a lot of Americans that are eligible to vote decline to vote. And that is, first of all, that should be cold comfort for Democrats. And it should reflect a hard reality that you can't simply win elections by saying that you shouldn't trust the other guy. You have to be able to stand in front of voters and tell them what you want to do. I also think, and this is purely my opinion, that this is the second time that the Democratic Party has nominated a woman and that they have underperformed in presidential elections. I think it will be a long time before either party places a woman at the top of the ticket, because I think the lesson that our political elites will take from that is that there is a segment of the electorate that simply won't vote for a woman. And I think that is a tragic lesson. And once again, the United States has never elected a female president. And that's all I'm going to say about that for now. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about how presidential power has expanded over the course of the 20th century. For much of the 19th century, presidents had more of a ministerial role. Their job was basically just to see to the execution of laws. They didn't really take on an activist role. Presidents began to act in a more kind of public way as we got into the progressive era, especially as we entered the 20th century. And certainly that really dramatically expanded the idea that presidents are political actors in their own right, really expanded when we got into the middle of the 20th century. And then we'll conclude with some discussions of presidential power and what we think about it. So presidential power expanded significantly over the course of the 20th century. And a big part of that, again, has to do with the fact that, we went through an industrial revolution that was largely kind of provoked by our experiences in the Civil War. Our industrial revolution was largely driven by, again, the expansion of the railroads, the intercontinental railroads, massive expansion of shipping, massive expansion of manufacturing in the late part of the 19th century. And the hard reality, we also dramatically began to expand the population. This was also a period when you saw large waves of immigration. And I'm simply going to say this: more people creates greater need for government, right? When people are living in very small communities, they are largely self-sufficient. They're growing their own food. They're making their own clothes. They have their own little insular communities. The need for government is relatively modest. That begins to change when we go through industrialization, because one of the main aspects of industrialization is also urbanization. More and more people are moving to where the jobs are. And in many instances, that means you're seeing enormous leaps in population density. And dense populations require more government. It requires more regulatory activity. It requires larger police. You see the transition for a long time. Fire departments were actually private. They were private fire companies. When you see huge, densely packed, populations, you saw lots and lots of private fire departments showing up, and they would actually, get into fistfights at the scenes of fires because they wanted to be the ones to put out the fire. That becomes unworkable. Again, as you see more and more, people, moving into and living in cities. So you need larger police forces. You need a fire department that is, again, typically local. That is a local matter more often than not. You begin, as you begin seeing huge wildfires spreading in the Mountain West, you begin seeing states developing fire combating, capacities. You see, again, all these, again, lots of people in one place. You see hospitals begin to emerge. Okay, all of these things are what we call public goods, and they require government to do them well. So that is naturally going to lead to more government, and it also leads to a greater need for some kind of executive power, greater executive power. The presidential political, he's an expert on the presidency, a guy named Richard Neustadt, basically said that the fundamental aspect of presidential power within our American system of government is persuasion. Okay? Presidents have to be able to persuade people that what they want to do, that the vision that they have for the country is something that needs to be pursued. Again, I will make the case for Donald Trump. Donald Trump basically campaigned in 2016 saying that the silver bullet that will solve many problems for America is resolving the immigration problem. And the solution that he had was build a wall. Well, he had 2 years where he had unified control of government and did not get a wall built. The reason for that is that even Republicans, even people, congressional Republicans, were not wholly sold on the idea that building a wall was going to solve the immigration problem. Okay, so again, political norms in the 19th century really discouraged executive activism, and presidents really didn't actively campaign for office or publicly work to support public policies. That was viewed as gauche, as gross, and so that really begins to change around the turn of the century, and with the election, really with the elevation of Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency. Now, Roosevelt was actually a vice presidential candidate of William McKinley. McKinley chose him because Teddy Roosevelt was a wildly popular guy in New York. McKinley, I believe, was from Ohio. And he was really one of the highest profile progressive Republicans. Now remember, the progressive era, we talked about this a couple of times during our discussions of federalism and a couple of other issues. Progressivism was a good government movement that both Democrats and Republicans had progressive wings and encompassed sort of a progressive argument. And it was basically a good government argument. And again, it notes it emerged in the 19th century, the late 19th century, kind of spans from around 1880 to roughly 1920. And it reflected this idea that we needed to have, first and foremost, a stronger state and more effective and accountable government. That corruption was a significant problem that many progressive era folks saw. And Roosevelt was a Republican progressive, and so McKinley picked him. McKinley was sort of a representative of the stalwart group of Republicans that were much more establishment, money-oriented folks. So McKinley was assassinated, and Roosevelt took over McKinley's term, and then won a term in his own right. He was far more active than previous presidents. He was far more willing to go out and speak on behalf of the policies that he was pushing, and he was very effective at forming bipartisan coalitions to combat corruption. Okay, Teddy Roosevelt was responsible for the inheritance tax. Teddy Roosevelt helped get a lot of the antitrust legislation that was passed. A lot of times with bipartisan coalitions. Okay, so he was very effective at forming these coalitions. He set aside a huge amount of land in the West. Basically claimed it as federal property, again, to preserve the environment, because again, in the West, many of those states were dominated by what we call extractive economic interests, right? The timber industry, the mining industry, and they were just strip mining everything, destroying the environment in many of these states. And so, taking that land and basically saying this land is going to be held inviolate for future generations, that was a progressive thing, and that was a Republican that did that, okay? Teddy Roosevelt also understood the importance of having a relationship with the media. And Teddy Roosevelt was the first president to make space available in the White House for reporters. And that gave birth to the White House Press Corps. Okay, so he understood the need for the presidency, especially the office of the president, to be able to get their message out to the public. Okay, so when you talk about the expansion of presidential power, there are a couple of ways you can do that, and one of them is by going public. The other is by reducing executive dependence on Congress. We'll talk about each of these kind of in turn. Okay, so the first thing that you could talk about is the idea of going public. And again, Teddy Roosevelt was one of the first to really aggressively do that. He was the guy that went out and addressed crowds and said, I need your support. I need you to put pressure on your members of Congress to support these policies. His successor, Woodrow Wilson, was really the first president to harness the power of the executive branch in advancing a particular policy. He formed a committee. It was called the Committee on Public Information, that went around the country and spoke and made presentations arguing why the United States could not remain neutral for long in World War I. Okay, and so that, he was prepping the ground. That's a military term where you talk about artillery. When you're softening a position for assault, you call that prepping the ground. And he seeded the public opinion with these arguments as to why the United States needed to enter World War I, and they needed to enter World War I on the side of England and France. Okay, so it's important to keep in mind that in 1912 and 1913 and 1914, there was a very large German population, relatively recent German immigrants, and public sentiment in some states was by no means favorable to England and France. There were a lot of people who were, who had a sense of feeling for their home country. And so those were arguments that needed to be had. And of course, ultimately, the United States did enter World War I after the sinking of the Lusitania and the revelation that Germany had been secretly negotiating with Mexico to get Mexico to attack the United States, which would have been a bad idea for Mexico. So that's really kind of where you begin to see presidents recognizing that Americans hearing their voice can be a powerful thing. Okay, I can't remember which president it was that was the first to actually have their voice recorded. It was one of those early 20th century presidents, and again, it was significant. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt's cousin, was the other guy that really, raised the idea of going public to an art. Okay, Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected again. He was governor of New York when he ran for president. He won the presidency in 1932, promising a New Deal for the forgotten man. And one of the first things he did was take to the radio, and radio was the dominant media of that day in 1932. Hardly anybody had a television at that point, but nearly every household had a radio, and people would gather around the radio to listen to whatever programming was on. And it's very important to keep in mind, Will Rogers was enormously popular in that period. He had one of the largest radio audiences of that era. And in 1932, the Roosevelt administration made the decision when they got elected that they were going to make radio addresses to the public, and that Franklin Roosevelt was going to talk about what his administration was planning to do to combat the Great Depression, which was, again, a horrible situation. Close to 1/3 of the American workforce was basically unemployed. The economy had absolutely cratered. And so the Roosevelt administration made this fateful decision to go to radio. And the first thing that they did was talk to Will Rogers and the producers of Will Rogers' program. And they basically, set it up so that Franklin Roosevelt would be giving his address immediately following Will Rogers' nightly program. Okay, because they understood the power that Will Rogers had. And so this is the first time you have the president addressing the nation, kind of nationally, if you will, and speaking in very calm and deliberative tones about what they were doing to try and secure the nation's banking system. Because again, one of the problems that happens when you get a depression, especially prior to many of the policies that have stabilized our banking industry, is that banks would go, they would crash. Right, banks would fail. They wouldn't be able to meet their depositors' demands, and that would cause what was known as a run on banks, where everyone would run to the bank to withdraw their deposits. And so Roosevelt basically said, first and foremost, you have to remain calm. The only thing is what he said in his inaugural address. The only fear itself is part of the problem here. And so here's what we're doing to secure your deposits. Your money is going to be safe if you leave it in the bank. And that's, he talked about the creation of the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which is today, it still is in effect. It still is an active, bureaucratic agency. And its job is to basically secure banks. Its job is to make sure that depositors, that the money that's in the bank is safe. And when a bank does face failure through mismanagement, they go in, they fire all the top people, and they basically determine how much money is in the bank and how much can be brought out to the depositors, and they have a huge sum of money that can make people whole. Again, in the event of bank failures. So Roosevelt had another problem, and that was that the dominant media of the day were newspapers, and those folks were, the newspapers of that day were controlled by very powerful and hostile business interests. And so again, he had to find more innovative ways to get his message out to the public. And he basically bypassed the newspapers, many of whom, again, really, really didn't like him. Later on in his administration, he said, as he was about to announce his run, I think for his third term, that he described his opponents as malefactors of great wealth. They hate me. And then he smiled and said, and I welcome their hatred. Roosevelt was one of the first genuinely polarizing presidents in American history. As much as he was beloved, and again, he was responsible for forming the New Deal coalition. He was beloved by millions of Americans, but he was also despised by millions of Americans. Republicans hated him because they viewed him as a traitor of sorts. He was a Roosevelt. He was from an enormously wealthy family, and yet he was enacting policies that kind of hurt the wealthy, redistributed wealth from the wealthy towards everyday Americans, and oh, did they hate him in that period of time. So from Roosevelt really to the present, presidents have risen and fallen on their ability to communicate, their ability to tell the public, that they are on their side and that they are working for them has been determinative oftentimes in figuring out how people will vote. I will tell you, here in 2024, a big part of the reason why Donald Trump won is that a solid majority of Americans are more fearful of undocumented immigration than they are of anything that Donald Trump might do otherwise. And they think that he's more likely to do something that will stop the flow of immigration. And it could be that they're correct. He certainly has lots and lots of motivation to do something. So presidents throughout the modern era have attempted to craft a public relations strategy that places their administration in the most favorable light. And this is one of the things that creates a lot of Americans say that they despise politics and they hate it. And a lot of it has to do with that public relations aspect of things. That everything seems to be about spin and about putting everything in the most positive light, and that is unfortunately an endemic aspect of American politics. It's hard to really get away from. So presidents, again, rise or fall in their ability to communicate effectively with the public. We have had a number of one-term presidencies, beginning, you can talk about Gerald Ford. He really was the first president to have become president without having received a single electoral college or popular vote. He literally was appointed to the vice presidency following the resignation of Spiro Agnew. And then subsequently elevated to the presidency following the resignation of Richard Nixon. He did not have a single vote to become president. Okay, and he struggled again because first and foremost, Republicans were in a bad light because of Nixon. His pardon of Nixon almost certainly hurt him with large numbers of Americans, and ultimately the economy was in a bad place. With stagflation and a number of other problems. So Ford was a one-term president and ultimately just wasn't successful at crafting the kind of message that could win Americans over. His successor, Jimmy Carter, likewise struggled. Carter was a very earnest, he was a religious man. He was, as a Democrat, he was a Southern Baptist. He gave an interview to Playboy magazine where he said, "I'll never lie to the American public." And that honesty was refreshing, and he was able to win the nomination in 1976 and able to defeat Gerald Ford, but he was unable ultimately to govern. Okay, part of the problem was I think he just had a basic misperception of presidential power. He clashed with the Speaker of the House, a fellow Democrat by the name of Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, just simply because Carter was inflexible. Carter would say, look, I think we need to do policy A. And Tip O'Neill would say, we don't have the votes for that. I can't get my own conference to vote for that, and I can't get any votes from Republicans. And Carter just could not understand that. Carter also attempted to act as his own chief of staff while he was president, and that ultimately did not work for him. He was not able to manage his own time effectively. He worked himself nearly to death. Carter was a very intelligent man, a hard-working man, but he really didn't know how to budget his time. He would stay up until 3 or 4 o'clock in the morning, get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and just try to burn the candle at both ends. And when you see pictures of him going into office versus pictures of him leaving office, the office just nearly destroyed him. Just 4 years took decades off of his life, it seemed like, and he's still alive today. His post-presidency is among, I think, one of the best of all of our ex-presidents. He's a genuinely good man. One of the presidents that was most successful in the modern era was John F. Kennedy. Now, Kennedy, again, was unique among presidents. First and foremost, he was a good-looking person. Secondly, he was very quick-witted, very quick on his feet. He knew a lot about politics. He was raised, his father, Joseph Kennedy, had been in politics himself, was a very political guy, again, a very wealthy man. He was, I believe, chosen by Franklin Roosevelt to be the first Securities and Exchange Commissioner, largely because he knew he knew how to cheat the marketplace. And so Kennedy was very smart, and he had a lot of friends in the media. He had a lot of journalists that he was very friendly with. And so he found that press conferences were one of the best ways for him to interact with the public. Not only was he successful at managing the press, he looked good on television, right? He looked good doing it. And that's one of those things that really kind of highlighted the effectiveness of somebody like John F. Kennedy. Ronald Reagan, offered a significant innovation in what became known as the line of the day. Faxes would go out to all Republicans. This is what we're talking about today. And the whole administration would be, addressing one particular issue. And that was a very effective way of getting, an entire administration pulling in the same direction. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama were very successful at using televised town halls where they would, answer questions from audience members. Oftentimes the questions were packaged. They were given to the public for them to read. But that worked for both Clinton and Barack Obama, again, because like Kennedy, they looked good on TV. They looked good interacting with people. As much as we remember Barack Obama as this very dignified person, he was very effective at looking at people and listening to them. And when you see a leader doing that, it can be enormously effective. Presidents subsequent to Bill Clinton have been very effective at using the White House Communications Office. And again, I mentioned in my last presentation that many people within the White House are basically message folks. And the White House Communications team, the Office of White House Communications, that's the nerve center of any administration. Presidents need to be able to communicate well, both with the press and with the public, and they need to have multiple avenues for getting a message out. So there are limits, and again, another important thing is, the idea increasingly now with social media, people are trying to go public online. Barack Obama was the first president to make routine use of social media as a communication strategy. But I think it's unquestionable that Donald Trump was the first, what we would call Twitter president. I guess we would call him an ex-president now, but that could be confusing. But he was the first guy to really rely heavily on social media to communicate directly with his public. Both campaigns in 2020 made extensive use of of social media. They all set up social media sites. That's been common practice, really going all the way back to the 2000 election. And so it's important to know the extent to which you can actually get your message out using social media. In this election cycle, podcasts were an enormously effective tool. A lot of people argued that Donald Trump going on Joe Rogan's podcast a few days before the election, and Kamala Harris's decision not to go on Joe Rogan, because again, the argument was she would have had to travel to Austin because Joe Rogan was not willing to uproot and go to Washington, D.C., that hurt her and helped Donald Trump. A lot of men in particular listen and watch Joe Rogan's podcast. The problem is that the more we rely on social media, the more we also know that there are loads and loads of disinformation and misinformation that can be found on social media. And so if people can be informed through social media, they can also be misinformed. And it's condescending to say that Donald Trump's voters were misinformed. But a lot of the stuff that Donald Trump was saying was not true. Okay? That's simply the reality. That is an objective fact. Donald Trump says a lot of untrue things. And people are, enormously impressionable. And that is simply one of the realities that both of our political parties are going to have to reckon with over time. So social media is transforming how modern presidents communicate, how they govern, and ultimately how they campaign for office. So what are the limits of going public? Public approval, this idea that when pollsters ask you, do you approve or disapprove? Do you strongly disapprove or strongly approve of a president? Public approval is the sine qua non, which is Latin for without which not, of presidential power. If Newstat was correct, and the essence of presidential power is the power to persuade, then the public's perception and the public's approval of the president is an essential ingredient for that. Okay? The problem is that presidential popularity can vanish fairly quickly. Because the public, again, studies have demonstrated this over and over again. The public does not have very deep levels of understanding or information about politics. And that makes their opinions highly volatile. We talked about this in our presentations on public opinion. So as quickly as a president can become beloved, a president can equally find their public approval ratings just disappearing. This happened to both George Herbert Walker Bush and Bush's son, George W. Bush. George W. Bush, heading into 1992, I was in graduate school at the time, and I remember a story. I was a teacher's assistant for one of these really large sections of American government at the University of South Carolina, and I was the assistant for the head of the department, a guy named Earl Black. He's really, his area of specialty is Southern politics, Harvard PhD, really brilliant man. He walked into class, and after the conclusion of the first Gulf War, and he said, right now, heading into a presidential election year, this was like probably January or February, George Herbert Walker Bush's approval ratings are close to 90%. Does anyone think that any Democrat right now has a chance of beating him? And most of the kids in the class were like, this was South Carolina. South Carolina is also a very conservative state. And most people thought, no, there's no way he'll coast He won't have any problems. But by November of 1992, George Herbert Walker Bush's approval ratings were underwater, well under 50%, and he ultimately would lose the presidency to Bill Clinton. The same thing happened to his son. George Bush won election narrowly. He lost the popular vote in 2000. He won re-election in 2004 and basically said, at one of his first press conferences, I earned political capital and I intend to use it. Well, he tried to privatize Social Security and that failed. He had a horrible, federal response to Hurricane Katrina. And then the war in Iraq began turning south. And then, to add to that, you had the subprime mortgage meltdown that happened in the last year of his presidency. He went again from having close to 90. I think his approval ratings were above 50% following his victory in 2004. He was in Harry Truman category. He was in the low 20. He was in the 20s by the time the November elections came around. And so he spent the last really 2 years of his presidency having very little influence within Washington, D.C. So successful presidents generally follow a predictable arc. You're popular. A majority of Americans typically will have voted for the president when they first get elected. Their approval ratings will oftentimes, because often or historically, even some members of the opposing party will say, we'll give him a chance. Okay, so many presidents typically begin their administrations with approval ratings close to 60%. Then you start governing, and what happens? You begin making decisions that alienate people, that anger people, and your approval ratings begin to decline. What happened to Joe Biden? Joe Biden, I believe, got elected in 2020 because he was not Donald Trump. Okay? Millions and millions of Americans voted for Joe Biden, not for anything that they thought Joe Biden could do for them, but because they really didn't want Donald Trump to continue in office. His approval ratings in 2021 and into 2022 were very high. And then what happened? The forced withdrawal from Afghanistan caused a serious hit to his public approval ratings, and then people began showing real concern about his age. A lot of Americans, his approval ratings are I believe, in the low 40s right now. Okay, a lot of the people that somewhat disapprove of Joe Biden, it's got less to do with the fact that it has a lot to do with inflation. And let's be clear, Joe Biden does not have a little inflation meter in the White House that he's cranking up and maniacally cackling as he raises the prices on goods. Presidents have very little control over inflation. They have very little control over the workings of the economy in general. But nevertheless, how he chose to deal with immigration, the fact that inflation occurred on his watch, which was again largely a COVID-related phenomenon, hurt Joe Biden significantly. Okay? Only 3 recent presidents, Ronald Reagan, Bill Clinton, and Barack Obama, left the White House with positive approval ratings, with approval ratings above 50%. Only one, and that's Bill Clinton, left office more popular than when he came into office. Keep in mind, Bill Clinton in 1992 was a plurality president. He only won about 44% of the popular vote. Because Ross Perot got over 20% of the popular vote. Even though Perot didn't win a single electoral college vote, he siphoned millions of votes, probably more votes from George Herbert Walker Bush, Clinton's opponent, than from Clinton himself. Another way that presidents have accrued power is through the administrative strategy. And one of the ways you can do that, again, is by increasingly relying on the agencies within the executive office of the president. And in particular, it's the creation of the Office of Management and Budget, which I'll talk about a little bit more in a second. So increased White House control over the federal bureaucracy gives presidents the ability to basically administer policies in ways when they can't when they can't persuade Congress to act. So expanded use of executive orders and other instruments of what one political scholar calls prerogative government, right? That ability to say, I'm just going to do this, and Congress can get mad, but their attempts to stop me are going to be ineffective. So the executive office of the president was created in 1939. And again, remember, over the course of the 1930s, you saw an enormous expansion of government, largely in response to the Great Depression, but also in response to the realities that the United States was headed for war. Franklin Roosevelt understood by 1938 that the United States would not be able to remain on the sidelines for the entirety of the war. And so the recognition was the president was going to need greater assistance in managing all the different federal programs that had popped up as a result of the New Deal and all these other programs. So the executive office of the president expanded from 6 administrative assistants to several hundred employees and over 4,000 staffers for the major executive office of the presidency offices. The Office of Management and Budget is probably one of the most significant, along with the National Security Council. Okay? It is a particularly effective tool that presidents can use to control how the bureaucracy is working. One of the most significant aspects of that is the idea of regulatory review. There is a very significant office within OMB, within the Office of Management and Budget, called the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. It's an office that you probably never have heard of, but it exerts enormous authority over federal spending and the regulatory and the rules-making process. This was created during the Nixon administration. And it provides presidents with a powerful tool for controlling the rule-making process of the executive branch agencies. There's a great a guy named Cass Sunstein. He wrote a book called Simpler, and it's all about his experience as being the head of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs under Barack Obama. So the statutory requirements for regulatory review are, again, designed to control spending and to prevent heavy-handed regulatory actions that actually harm the economy. So all rules go through a period of what is known as public notice, where contemplated rules are made available to the public for comment or protest prior to being published in the Federal Register. Public notice typically includes public hearings and legal appeals by people who may be adversely affected by a new rule. Once public notice has been completed, the rule is added to the Code of Federal Regulations, which is a massive compendium of all the rules that have been promulgated by the executive branch agency. And every president goes into office saying we have too many rules. There's a Supreme Court Justice, Neil Gorsuch, that actually wrote a book called Overruled, basically making the argument that there are too many federal rules and that too many Americans simply run afoul of of federal rules and regulations. The reality is we have a lot of rules and regulations because we are a continent-sized country with over 340 million people in it. That requires more government than a lot of people are comfortable with because they have unrealistic understandings of government. A third avenue that contemporary presidents have used to enhance their power is to govern unilaterally, otherwise known as governing by decree. Executive orders are presidential directives to the bureaucracy to undertake some action. It is, again, part of the president's assumption of executive authority. Some famous examples of executive orders include the Louisiana Purchase. Thomas Jefferson understood the Constitution didn't clearly articulate this authority to enable him to make a deal with France to purchase roughly 3/4 of North America, of what would become the United States. Nevertheless, he said, I'm going to do it. And he got Congress to kind of agree to that process. The annexation of Texas in 1845 took place through executive order. The Emancipation Proclamation immediately after the Battle of Gettysburg was the result of an executive order. Franklin Roosevelt's internment of Japanese Americans over the course of 1942 until 1946 was an example of a dark example of an executive order. There was no real clear evidence that Japanese Americans posed a national security threat. It was racism that caused Americans of that day to, basically take people out of their homes, take them out of their businesses. There were hundreds of thousands of Japanese there were homeowners, there were business owners, forcibly moved to camps in California all the way up to Washington State, all the way out to, I believe, to New Mexico. These were many of them second and third generation Japanese Americans. They may have felt a sense of affection for Japan, but they left Japan for a reason. It's interesting too. We did not inter Japanese Americans living in Hawaii at the time because it was simply too large of a population. We simply couldn't, but we did surveil them. And what we found was they weren't doing anything. Okay. Likewise, again, another, a brighter chapter was in 1948. Harry Truman used executive orders to integrate the military. Up until that point, to the extent that black Americans were serving in the military, they were in subservient roles. They weren't allowed to really serve, formally in combat, or they were in segregated units. Okay. Desegregation of the U.S. military was one of the first shots of what would become the civil rights movement. Because remember, one of the ways that Franklin Roosevelt used the New Deal and won support from Southern Democrats was by peppering the South with military installations, right? Many of these military bases were created during the Great Depression. Okay, some of them predated. I was born at Fort Benning, which is now known as Fort Moore. It's confusing to me, but I'm okay with it. Fort Benning, Henry Benning was a Confederate. He betrayed his oath to his country. I don't think we should be naming military installations after traitors. So now it's named after Hal Moore, who was a great American military figure. Fort Moore was actually created, around World War I. But many other military installations in the South were created during the Great Depression. And again, integrating the military meant that those towns, proximate to those military installations were now confronted with black soldiers. And that was a major source of controversy in the 1940s and the 1950s. So executive orders can be powerful, particularly when presidents lose control of Congress. Barack Obama came into office in 2008. They had unified control of government. They were dominant. They had 60 votes in the Senate in 2008. They had a 40-something seat majority in the House of Representatives. But with the passage of the Affordable Care Act, Democrats took an enormous hit in the midterm elections. They lost control of the House of Representatives. And so Barack Obama faced a choice. He either could simply do nothing, sit around for the next 2 years. He almost certainly would have been defeated for re-election, or he could have taken action. And what he said in one of his inaugural addresses was, I have a phone and I have a pen. And what he basically meant by that was, I am going to call people and I am going to use executive orders to advance what I think needs to be done for the American people. And those actions included the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, the DACA program, prohibitions on federal agencies and contractors discriminating against transgender employees, the Iran nuclear deal, declaring more than 700,000 square miles of the Central Pacific Ocean off limits to factory shipping. These were all significant actions that he did kind of independently. Okay, Trump issued 219 executive orders over the course of his first term of office, including reversing several of Obama's executive orders, including, for example, the DACA and also the Iran nuclear deal. Biden, upon taking office, subsequently reversed many of Trump's executive orders. This has simply become what we do when presidents come into office. So looking at this chart here, you can get a sense of which presidents were most aggressive at using executive orders, and what events were likely most likely to draw an executive order. If you look at the chart, obviously Franklin Roosevelt issued the most, and the reason, again, first of all, incredible emergency, and then he was dealing with World War II. But secondly, he was in office a really long time, right? He was elected in 1932. He died in 1944. He would have been in office for 16 years had he lived out his fourth term of office. That, again, that's the record, and it's not going to be broken because our Constitution, basically prevents anyone from serving more than 2 terms or 10 total years in office. So what are some rationales for executive orders? First of all, again, that they are deploying their Article II powers. Presidents are required to state the constitutional or statutory basis for their actions. A good example is Lyndon Johnson's executive order that government contractors had to initiate affirmative action programs in hiring, stated that it was in furtherance of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Supreme Court has rarely struck down executive orders because, generally speaking, the Supreme Court has adopted a very deferential stance as it relates to presidential authority. There are other kinds of executive, administrative actions that presidents can take. You have administrative orders, you have national security findings, you have presidential memoranda, and then you have presidential proclamations. If you recall, Abraham Lincoln, it's called the Emancipation Proclamation. This is a public declaration of policy. These actions have significance as statements of policies. Presidents use them sometimes interchangeably, depending on what they're doing and why they're doing it. Congress can overturn these kinds of orders based on the president's delegated authority, and they can do so by legislative declaration. But again, the president's control of their own party, the president's influence within their party, can oftentimes make that very difficult for Congress to do. Okay? And even if Congress does do it, presidents can veto those legislative proclamations. Again, presidents have the upper hand in administrating the government. Another important aspect of presidential authority is the idea of signing statements. Now, historically, a signing statement is something that a president will give a brief speech when they're at a signing ceremony, and usually it's just something that is lauding the intent and the goals of the bill that he's signing. This bill will help the American people. Then they're going to sit down at a table. They're going to have a bunch of pens. They'll have a bunch of people lined up behind them. They'll very laboriously scrawl their name, and every time that they use, they'll get one of these presidential pens, and then they'll hand it off to a supporter or one of the people that helped draft the bill or something like that, or somebody that's going to be affected by the bill. Those kinds of statements are more rhetorical commentary, okay, than on the significance of the law rather than having any kind of real legislative significance. But signing statements began to have more significance during the later phases of the Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan's Attorney General, Ed Meese, basically made the argument that signing statements should be included in the Federal Register. And that meant that signing statements became part of the legislative history of legislation. And that has meant at times that signing statements have legal significance. Now, when presidents are going beyond the mere rhetorical flourish of saying this bill is a great bill, they are oftentimes pointing to an area where they might disagree with a law. They will say, there is an aspect of this bill that I find constitutionally troubling. Or they may say, there is an aspect of this law that is drafted in a way that I think invites confusion. Right? They will then say, here is how I intend to handle the constitutional challenges presented by this law. Or they will say, here is how I interpret this piece, this part of the, this passage of the law, and here is how I intend to implement that law. So that begins to have a lot more significance, okay? And one president who used signing statements in ways that some people found constitutionally troubling was George W. Bush. George W. Bush frequently used signing statements in a way to almost negate aspects of a law. At one point, for example, Congress passed a law banning the use of torture as a way as a method of interrogating people captured during the War on Terror. George W. Bush issued a signing statement basically saying, we don't torture. Well, we had been torturing people. We had been waterboarding people, and waterboarding is an acknowledged torture method. It is, when you strap a wet paper cloth over someone's face and then pour water over them, you are simulating their drowning. Anyone that has had a near drowning incident knows that that is torture. Okay? We waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed 160 something times. Okay? That is torture. Nevertheless, nevertheless, George W. Bush asserted in a signing statement, the United States does not engage in torture. So presidents also have what is known as administrative discretion as it relates to certain aspects of executing a law. Okay, this is something, for example, that Barack Obama began dealing with. In the first couple of years of Barack Obama's administration, Barack Obama apprehended more people at the border than any president before or any president since. Okay, and it was creating problems administratively. First and foremost, going into, presidential election cycle, Barack Obama knew that he was doing things that were antagonizing the Latino community. Okay? So he basically said, as chief law enforcement officer, I have to make determinations as to which aspects of the law I'm going to obey and which aspects of the law I simply lack the resources to manage. Okay, that was one of the things that Barack Obama said many times was, we need to reform immigration law. And he could not get Congress to act on it. He could not get Congress to draft legislation that would have, clarified what it takes for someone to come to this country legally. Okay? So in many instances, members of Congress, particularly Republicans, accused Barack Obama of violating his oath of office, violating the Take Care Clause provision of Article 2 that says that presidents are legally obliged to take care to faithfully execute the laws. Likewise, Barack Obama suspended aspects of the Affordable Care Act, particularly when they were trying to create the online federal marketplace. They found out very quickly they simply didn't have the resources to build a website that wouldn't crash. And so they had to bring in people from outside. And in the meantime, they had to suspend aspects of the Affordable Care Act while the government was getting its act together. Okay? Likewise, Donald Trump, he basically said, and his vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, said that Donald Trump protected the Affordable Care Act. He didn't. When they failed to repeal the Affordable Care Act, Donald Trump issued executive orders basically saying that the IRS was not to enforce the health care mandate. The mandate is basically part of the Affordable Care Act. It was the conservative aspect of the law that said everybody has an obligation to get some kind of health care. And that if you didn't, you were compelled to pay what in the legislation was described as a fine, but in the Supreme Court's decision upholding the Affordable Care Act, they basically said, no, it really is a tax. Okay? So what are the advantages of the administrative strategy? First and foremost, we have this overhang of the culture war. In times of enormous partisan polarization, presidents having the ability of going it alone enables them to advance the things that are particularly important to them. Okay? In theory, again, Congress can push back on these things. But doing so makes it difficult. Again, they have to pass legislation reversing an executive order, and that will be subject to a veto. And overriding a veto requires a 2/3 majority. Regardless, right now Republicans are going to have control of the Senate. It's likely that they will retain control of the House, but again, it will be very narrow. They probably won't have more than the 4-seat advantage that they came into the election with. And so it's going to be really hard for them to get Democrats to go along with any kind of veto that Joe Biden would have put in place in between now and the new Congress being sworn in. Okay, and likewise, Democrats will not, they're not going to have to worry about that because Republicans will go along with whatever it is that Donald Trump intends to do as president. Okay, so presidents, congressional allies in those kinds of conflicts are critical. To the extent that they support the president, to the extent that the president retains the support of his party in Congress, presidents are relatively invulnerable in those kinds of conflicts over executive orders and other administrative procedures. So what are the limits of presidential power? First and foremost, the checks and balances, right? The framers had no intention of creating an all-powerful executive, and they established numerous checks on executive authority. The ultimate check is impeachment, right? And I think we discussed impeachment a couple of presentations ago. It is a political remedy for political crimes. Donald Trump was impeached twice over the course of his first term. He was not removed because Republicans in the Senate refused to remove him. And only a handful of Republicans in the House actually went along with impeachment. Impeachment as a political tool for limiting presidential power is virtually useless in today's environment. And largely, that is a reflection of partisan polarization. The Senate's advice and consent authority oftentimes frustrates presidents' appointment and treaty-making authority. And that creates, again, a very, an environment that presidents can be constrained by. Again, I think going into 2025, Donald Trump will have no problem with any kind of appointments he wants to make. Recess appointments in divided government, opponents, again, oftentimes will issue holds on key appointments. Over the course of the Biden administration, Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville issued holds on hundreds of military promotions because he objected to a military policy that enabled a pregnant service member, a woman service member who was pregnant, to travel to a military installation where abortions in a state where pregnancy terminations are legal. He objected to that policy, and he issued holds to that effect. That was one of the, I'm going to try to find the right way of saying that. That was one of the most reckless and imprudent and disruptive uses of senatorial holds in the history of our country. And ultimately, he was finally compelled to lift those holds, mainly by members of his own party shaming him. Article 2, Section 2 authorizes presidents to fill up vacancies that may happen during a recess of the Senate. Now, one of the ways that the Senate has prevented the use of recess appointments is by never going out of session. There is always someone, usually it's a member from Virginia or Maryland or one of the connecting states that is very close to their, they probably have their homes, within minutes in the suburbs of Virginia or Maryland. They can just go in, gavel the session, Senate is in session, and then gavel the Senate out of session. And that, in theory, keeps the Senate in session so that presidents lack the ability to issue these kinds of recess appointments. So they're never going out of session. And critics have argued that those kinds of pro forma sessions violate the Senate's own rules because they typically lack a quorum with which to conduct business. Okay, Barack Obama objected to it and attempted to make appointments to the Consumer Protection Bureau. I can't remember the whole name of it. Ultimately, the Supreme Court upheld the legality, the constitutionality of pro forma Senate sessions. And so the result is that presidents can be constrained if the Senate is controlled by the other party and doesn't want the president to make certain kinds of appointments. Donald Trump, during his first term of office, routinely made use of acting appointments. I think I have mentioned that Donald Trump went through an enormous number of executive branch leaderships. He had, several secretaries of state. He had several secretaries of defense. And in many instances, rather than formally nominating someone, he would just simply name people as acting. And he basically said, again, by 2019, which again was 3 years into his office, he had failed to nominate 150 out of 705 appointees requiring Senate confirmation. And in many of those instances, the people that he had gotten into Senate confirmed positions had resigned, and he had replaced them with acting people. Okay. Trump basically said, I like acting because I can move quickly. It gives me flexibility. Well, the reality, too, is it puts people who are otherwise subject to Senate confirmation in positions where they have to be personally loyal to the person of Donald Trump and not to the Constitution. Okay? And that is, for many constitutional scholars, an area of serious concern. And many scholars during Trump's first term of office voiced concern that Trump was violating the Federal Vacancies Reform Act of 1998. Okay, the FVRA essentially provides the president 300 days to unilaterally appoint someone to a Senate-confirmed position. Critics argued that Trump kept critical high-level positions in the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security unfilled and kept several acting appointees unlikely to have earned Senate confirmation, people like Matthew Whitaker as acting Attorney General or Ken Cuccinelli as Director of Immigrations and Custom Enforcement, well past the 300-day limit. And these are going to be areas of concern that we're going to have for Donald Trump coming in to office. One thing that we know is that Donald Trump has not filed most of the paperwork dealing with presidential transitions. Presidential candidates have to sign memorandums of understanding that they will undertake certain activities over the course of that transition period. That is designed to ensure continuity of government. Donald Trump didn't do that in 2016. Over the course of 2017, prior to his inauguration. He did not hit the ground running in 2017. This time around, he refused to do it. And why? Why do you think he did? I would argue it's because he fully intends to implement Project 2025. And he didn't want to have to, acknowledge that he was going to be using all these people that the American Enterprise Institute has been vetting, as a basis for personal loyalty to Donald Trump rather than to the Constitution. This is something that we're going to have to keep an eye on as we move into Donald Trump's second term of office. So the presidency, what do you think? The framers envisioned a collaborative system in which the political institutions would share power. That was another great quote from Richard Neustadt. The idea of the separation of powers is a misnomer. What we really have are separate institutions sharing power. Okay? Over time, presidents have generally centralized greater degrees of control over the federal government. To some extent, that is unavoidable, for the simple fact that the larger the country, the more administrative capacity the federal government needs, that administrative capacity is naturally going to result in the expansion of presidential power. A powerful president and a weakened Congress and an apathetic electorate, and remember, I think I mentioned at the start of this presentation, probably up to 16 million people who voted in 2020 did not vote in 2024. That is a recipe for potentially authoritarian government. Presidential power is innately polarizing. A win for the president is often perceived as a loss for the other party. Should so much power be granted to one person? Have the systems of checks and balances we have discussed earlier held up? Will they hold up when we have another president who again feels unconstrained by the law? Are presidents more able to overcome congressional and judicial checks on the pathway to asserting uncheckable powers? How did your experience in the 2024 election reflect your views of the Republican and Democratic parties' candidates? Which candidate did you think will be a better president? Why? Why do you think that? 66% of Americans supported, or 66% of Oklahomans supported Donald Trump. But only 53% of Americans, of eligible Oklahoma voters, bothered to show up in 2024. I don't think that if every registered Oklahoma had decided to vote, that it would have mattered here in Oklahoma. But we're still in a place where we are intensely divided, where we actively dislike other Americans. And we have to find ways of governing going forward. We have to find ways of accommodating our differences. And we have to stop, we have to find ways of preventing people from abusing authority. So that's all for this, our presentations on the presidency. When we come back, we're going to move on to bureaucracy, okay, which is, again, oftentimes an expression of presidential authority. But it's important to take a look at bureaucratic power in its own light, because bureaucracy oftentimes, again, has unique capacities to act independently of either Congress or the presidency. Okay? So we will learn more about that next week, and I will see you next time.